the procurators of St. Mark's decided to do something about this, and so they wrote letters to the Venetian ambassadors and residents all over Italy asking for suggestions as to a possible successor.
One such request was received by the Venetian resident in Milan.
Since the death of our Maestro di Cappella at our Church of St. Mark's, various people have been proposed, among others Signor Claudio Monteverdi.
The general opinion about Monteverdi was so favourable that he was invited to Venice to display his talents, with a composition which was almost certainly his great Vespers of 1610, written 3 years before. On the morning of August the 13th, he rehearsed this showpiece at San Giorgio Maggiore, and in the afternoon he performed it at St. Mark's. Monteverdi must have pleased the authorities with this astonishing work. He was immediately hired at a salary 50% higher than his predecessors. The Venetians gave him a handsome sum for his travelling expenses, 50 ducats. It was a major change from the stingy treatment he'd always received from his previous employers, the Gonzagas of Mantua, who hardly ever paid him his wages at all. Monteverdi's wife, Claudia, had died 6 years earlier. He had hired a maidservant to help him bring up his 2 young sons. And it was this small party that returned to his hometown of Cremona to pack up and move house for the last time. They collected their belongings, and with his expenses, he splashed out on a new serge coat. On the way back to Venice, they were robbed in some desolate marshland. It could have been an insider job, as one of the servants had disappeared the previous day. They lost almost all their worldly goods, including the coat. Monteverdi arrived in Venice with nothing.
Eventually, his own boatman was suspected of the crime, but Monteverdi was a mild man and had no real evidence, so decided not to pursue the matter any further. In some ways, that robbery marked an appropriate end to the 10 years ill treatment he'd received in Mantua. From now on, his life was going to take a very different turn. Instead of having to go cap in hand every time he wanted his wages, he was to be paid regularly and handsomely, and generally to receive all the respect that his genius deserved. And so, as he and his little party were rowed across the lagoon and he caught his first sight of the towers and campanili of the city that was to be his home for the next 30 years, his heart must have soared within him.
By then, Venice was no longer the magnificent trading nation she'd once been. The Turks had mopped up most of her overseas empire in the eastern Mediterranean. But she was still mistress of a sizable chunk of northeast Italy, stretching almost as far as Milan. And of course, she was still that same rich, opulent city that she'd always been. And, thanks to her lagoon, the safest place in all Italy.
What do you think it was like for a non-Venetian like Monteverdi to come to settle in Venice? Did they give him a hard time, do you think?
I would expect they probably would have at first, because all Venetians, first of all, think that any Venetian can do something better than anybody else can.
And I'm sure an awful lot of people said, why did they have him? Why did they get this chap from Cremona or Mantua, wherever he comes from? Why didn't they get a perfectly good Venetian like me, you know? I'm sure there was a certain amount of that. At the same time, as you say, he was an Italian, and I'm sure that being an Italian, at least he had a much easier time than, let's say, an Englishman or a Frenchman or a German would have had. But I think the average other non-Italian arriving in Venice had to watch his P's and Q's very much in the 17th century. All the city-states of Italy were police states, or tried to be. It was just that Venice was more efficient than anywhere else. Her prison was a constant reminder of the presence of the dreaded Council of Ten, whose powers over life in the city were absolute and beyond appeal. Early risers, walking through the Piazzetta in the morning, were often greeted with the sight of the bodies of offenders against the state hanging between the two columns. So the new maestro must have been only too aware of the brutal realities of Venetian life. Crowds of tourists that throng the streets around San Marco every summer have no idea that they're just a few yards away from a quiet, calm, cool little courtyard in what is known as the Casa Canonica, and in which Claudio Monteverdi had his only flat, his only home in Venice, the one that he lived in for just over 30 years. It was the official apartment of the Maestro di Capella of St. Mark's, immediately under the far more splendid apartments of the Patriarch above. And it was here, on the first floor, this row of windows here where he not only lived, but where he worked, where he wrote, we can assume, virtually everything that he produced in the 30 years that he was in Venice, and where he taught his pupils. From here, he had backdoor access to the Basilica, a route he must have followed several times a day.
When Monteverdi arrived at St. Mark's, he found the standard of the choir and instrumentalists alarmingly low. The standard size of the choir was 30 singers and 6 instrumental players, that is to say, the instrumental players who were needed on a regular day-to-day basis. The 30 singers included castrati, who were young males who were castrated in their youth in order to preserve their pretty soprano or alto voices. There was another difficulty here at St. Mark's, and that was that the liturgy was different than that used otherwise in the Catholic Church, which meant you couldn't import the church music that other people had written because it didn't work for St. Mark's. It also meant that the most convenient thing to do was to have a house composer, in this case Claudio Monteverdi, write the music you needed.
Music was needed not only in the church, but outside for processions in the huge piazza. And there were 40 major festivals a year in Venice, each on the scale of a British royal wedding. 3 years after his appointment, he received this note from his employers at St. Mark's.
The procurators, knowing the worth and efficiency of Don Claudio Monteverdi, have by ballot determined that he shall be confirmed in his post, for a salary of 400 ducats per year.
400 ducats was a great deal of money, more than 10 times the wages of a top singer in the choir. Most of his church music was lost in the 3 centuries when Monteverdi was out of fashion. This piece, from a Vespers of 1640, has survived. In 1628, Heinrich Schütz, the greatest German composer of his age, returned to Venice. Some years before, he had studied with Giovanni Gabrieli, whom he always venerated. But he clearly felt the same about the new maestro, whom he described as the ingenious Signor Claudio Monteverdi. The admiration must have been mutual, since Schütz was asked to make a contribution to one of the state's most impressive pageants, the Ascension Day ceremony of the symbolic wedding of Venice to the sea. The huge Bucintoro, the Doge's state barge, bearing all 400 members of the Senate, was rowed to a spot near the Lido. There, the Doge threw a ring into the sea, the eternal mistress of the Serenissima and source of all her greatness. Loved Monteverdi, whose fame added still more luster to her reputation. For him, after his experiences in Mantua, the city must have seemed like a heaven on earth. He had one of the finest musical establishments in Europe, his social position was high, his future and that of his sons, one of whom had joined the choir, was secure. Even the air was better. Moreover, the city was immune from attack, except from one quarter. Claudia, Monteverdi's wife, had died in Mantua in 1607, and it was from that city that the plague spread southwards to Venice in 1630. The authorities were accustomed to the disease, and many of the islands were sealed off as usual. But a city relying entirely on seaborne trade for its survival couldn't keep out the invader for long. Within 18 months, 46,000 Venetians had died, more than a third of the population.
The end of the plague was celebrated in St. Mark's on the 28th of November, 1631. But the Venetians decided that some more tangible monument was required. And, my goodness, they got it.
Santa Maria della Salute stands at the head of the Grand Canal. The church was built in thanks for the end of the plague, but another thank offering was provided by Europe's most illustrious composer.
There was sung a solemn mass composed by Signor Claudio Monteverdi, Maestro di Cappella, the glory of our century.
But if St. Mark's was rich in musical tradition, the city of Venice itself also offered enormous opportunities for Monteverdi's talents. While working at the Gonzaga court in Mantua, he had written some religious music like the Vespers. But most of his energy went into composing pieces for the entertainment of the court. Here in Venice, there was a huge public hungry for informal music, as an English visitor noted in the middle of the century.
The Venetians are addicted to music, especially that of the voice. There's no porter or cobbler but can finger some instrument. So when the heats of the day are done, the streets resound with confused but pleasant notes.
Monteverdi's employers, the procurators of St. Mark's, were perfectly happy for him to compose music for others, so long as it didn't interfere with his duties in the basilica. Although Venice is small in scale, barely 3 miles by 1, it provided a huge market for a composer with an international reputation. For a start, there are 70 parishes, each with its own saint's day. Moreover, there were 100 confraternities and trade guilds, also with their saints' days, for which new music was regularly commissioned. And there were the rich, sophisticated, pleasure-loving Venetians themselves, in whose palaces was performed the private, social music that any gifted amateur could manage. And it was above all in this sphere that Monteverdi became famous during his lifetime. He had been writing these popular songs since he was a boy, and had had his first collection published when he was 16. His books of madrigals sometimes went through 6 editions. Monteverdi always had strong views about performance. In this madrigal, for example, the Nymph's Lament, a girl has been abandoned by her lover. The composer specifies that the men who comment on the girl's plight and sympathize with it must stand near her but apart. Monteverdi published 9 books of madrigals. His music is so varied that it's hardly possible to offer even the briefest summary of them. Love poems, poems about war, laments, all of life's dramas and joys.
The 17th century has a strangely monochrome quality, as if the whole thing had somehow been shot in black and white. The age of the great 16th century colorists, of the Titians, the Giorgiones, the Veroneses, that was gone away in the past. And of course, the age of the great 18th century, of the Canalettos and the Guardis and the Tiepolo's, that was still equally far away in the future.
But life wasn't all drab. The Venetians may have had a talent for trade, but they also knew how to enjoy themselves. And while Monteverdi wrote no purely instrumental music, there were plenty of others who did. One of the maestro's patrons was the poet Julius, who wrote the libretti for 2 of his lost operas, including the first comic opera in the history of music. Strozzi had what appears to have been an illegitimate daughter. She was called Barbara and was born in 1619, and she became the most celebrated woman composer of her age, particularly of canzonas or solo songs.
Barbara Strozzi should have been a composer as well as a singer. In fact, during the 17th century, there was quite a tradition of women publishing their own music. Girls who'd been brought up either in the orphanages or in musical families, were expected to write their own music, just the same as the men singers wrote music for themselves. And we have letters from Monteverdi, who was actually saying, give this outline to the girls and they will embellish it themselves. They know how to do it. And it was a tradition that if you were a singer, you would embellish, you would ornament, and you would also compose certain passages for yourself if needed for a specific event.
And there certainly were plenty of such events. Venice at this time was a giant musical emporium. People came from all over Europe, searching for performers to grace their princely courts, to buy music, and to buy instruments. Cremona, Monteverdi's birthplace, was renowned for its makers of fine, bowed instruments. The Venetians specialized in the lute and its Italian cousin, the chitarrone. This was the instrument that the amateurs loved to play. Monteverdi was kept busy composing for his customers, both inside and outside the church. Only his interest in music for the stage had had no chance to express itself since he left Mantua. One of his private patrons did commission a scene from him. It was neither opera nor madrigal, but something in between. The battle between Tancredi and Clorinda.
The Combattimento, which was first performed here in this Montenegro Palace, which is now the Hotel Danieli, was one of Monteverdi's major dramatic achievements. What he did was to write a pocket opera in 20 minutes. You've got the whole of a grand opera, all its effects by, mind you, this hasn't happened yet. There isn't any grand opera. He's creating it in front of your astonished eyes. He has the voices used, for the first time, in a wildly dramatic fashion. They express love, rage, hate, war, and not enough, he's got to have the violins doing the same thing. So he has to resort to that famous Hollywood trick, the sinister tremolo violins. First time in the history of music.
Monteverdi at his most innovative, not only experimenting with new musical forms, but exploring the relationship between emotion and music.
tendió la vendetta, la vendetta. E la vendetta poi lontaninoma. Onde se fa la fretta. Di buon uomo raggiunge piaga nova. Dorino tutti invece, stretta sta la puglia e spada fra l'anciova. Danzi con pomi, e telluditi e crudi.
Only when Tancred has slain his opponent does he discover that she's a woman. In 1636, two singers travelled from Rome to Venice looking for work. They applied to Monteverdi for a place in the choir at St. Mark's, and he snapped them both up. Their arrival indirectly helped to reawaken a talent for the newest musical form, opera. In that year, 1636, Monteverdi reached his 69th birthday and might reasonably have expected to drift into a serene old age. But the two Roman singers changed all that, for both of them had recent valuable experience in the theatre. Their names were Benedetto Ferrari and Francesco Manelli.
In the following year, 1637, Manelli managed to persuade the Venetian authorities to allow him to open up a public opera house here in the parish of San Cassiano, in an old theatre that had previously been used for the Commedia dell'arte. They actually opened with an opera he'd written himself called Andromeda, long since forgotten, but that doesn't matter. What makes this thing fascinating is that here, for the first time, opera, which until then had been the preserve of the nobility and gentry, was opened up to the general public for the very reasonable charge of 4 lire, although, of course, the nobility kept the boxes for themselves. Unfortunately, the theatre itself is gone, though I suspect that these arches would probably formed a part of it. And of course the name, the Corte del Teatro Vecchio, the courtyard of the old theatre, still remains. But for me, what really makes this fascinating is to think that here, among these tangled, dark, twisted alleyways and streets, was born the public opera that we know today. Opera was one of the most exciting innovations of the Baroque period. From having been the preserve of princes in their palaces, suddenly it became the rage of Western Europe and beyond. And soon there were opera houses from Lisbon to St. Petersburg, from Vienna to Louisiana. We are just approaching the Opera House of Venice, the Teatro La Fenice, for my money, perhaps the loveliest opera house in the world. Like all buildings in Venice, you can get to it by land or by water. But in the old days, everybody who came to the opera, however short a distance they had to come from, always arrived by water. Even John and Effie Ruskin, when they were in Venice in the 1840s, they lived in what's now the Gritti Palace Hotel, not more than perhaps 200 yards away. But whenever they came to the Fenice in the evening, they invariably took the gondola.
There's no trace left today of any of the early theatres, only the street names. But we know that the San Moise Theatre opened with an opera that Monteverdi had written 31 years earlier for the court at Mantua, Arianna. At the point we joined the story, Ariadne has been abandoned by Theseus on a rock.
ti dura forte in così gran matire. Lasciatemi morire,
The beauty and simplicity of that lament caught the ear and the heart of all Europe, a tribute to the power of Monteverdi's music. But the tragedy is that that's all we have left.
The rest of the opera is lost. Well, how is it possible? I think the reason is because, except for Orfeo, Monteverdi's operas weren't printed, and manuscripts are easily disposable. The opera goes out of fashion, nobody cares, it gets lost. Well, I think nonetheless that, you know, there really is the possibility that we could find one of those lost Monteverdi operas, because just recently they found at least the libretto of an opera called Andromedeo, which nobody even knew existed. Here are all those marvelous moldering palaces, and in any one of those there might be a library, and in the library might be sitting a score of a lost Monteverdi opera. It is not actually a mad conceit of mine. It could really happen.
Monteverdi wanted real people in his operas, real people with real feelings. This was how he reacted when asked to write music for a subject he disliked.
The personages of this drama are winds, and the winds have to sing. How, dear sir, shall I be able to imitate the speech of the winds, since they do not speak? And how shall I be able to move the passions by their means?
When they revived Arianna, Monteverdi was 72. 3 years later, he wrote his greatest opera, L'Incoronazione di Poppea. It's extraordinary to think that this pious old man could write the music to such a worldly and licentious drama. Yet Monteverdi obviously relished this story, a story in which villainy wins out completely. Nero manages to get rid of his wife and marry his mistress Poppea. The end, with its open cynicism, is astonishing. The victory of pure evil, displayed in a ravishing love duet between the emperor and his whore. Reflected the Venetian taste of the time. It couldn't possibly have been staged in Rome. Courtesans, which after all Poppea was, were one of the attractions which drew increasing numbers of tourists to Venice. They were even listed in a visitor's guide to the city. In that climate, an opera which glorified the oldest profession was perfectly acceptable.
What I have in front of me here is one of 2 manuscripts that survives of L'Incarnazione di Poppea, which was never printed in Monteverdi's lifetime. We have a problem with Incarnazione di Poppea, and the problem is this. Whereas for Orfeo, we know exactly what orchestra Monteverdi had at his disposal, we don't know what orchestra he used with the Incarnazione di Poppea. And not only that, we don't even know which instruments were used. If you look at this manuscript, it doesn't say a thing. There are 3 lines here for this overture. We don't know who played them. And if you turn to the beginning of the opera, you could see it's a recitative. Well, we know who played that. That obviously was a harpsichord and various continuo instruments. But as for who played what when, What went on in the eyes, we haven't a clue. So that every time you hear Incarnazione di Popea, somebody else has had a hand in it. It's been orchestrated and put together by somebody else.
Monteverdi had taken holy orders in the church of San Maurizio in 1631, perhaps with his old age in mind. But his priesthood never seems to have hindered his love of dramatic music, nor his willingness to take on risky themes. At the age of 76, Monteverdi obtained leave from his employers to make a farewell visit to the town of his birth, Cremona, and the city of his earliest triumphs and hardest struggles, Mantua. He found Mantua pillaged in a war to decide the succession to the dukedom, a shadow of its former self. Many of his early works had perished in the fighting, but not fortunately or failed, first performed in the ducal palace on a memorable evening in the springtime of his life. Monteverdi returned to Venice just in time. On November the 29th, 1643, he died. He was buried here in a chapel in the Church of the Frari, and his death was keenly felt in Venice.
The news of such a loss upset and turned all the city to sadness and mourning, and was accompanied not by singing from the choir of St. Mark's, but by their tears and weeping.
All right, Monteverdi dies in 1643, I think, before the century has gone half through its course. What happens in musical Venice for the rest of the time?
Well, the first thing that happened was, of course, Monteverdi's star pupil, Francesco Cavalli, burst on the scene. Even in Monteverdi's lifetime, he probably took over helping to mount the revival of Incarnazione di Popea, and then went on to become a very successful opera composer in his own right. And then, as the century went on, of course, what happens is that they began to realize that comic opera, dealing with real people like you and me now, was an entirely new possibility. And so, as the century ended, opera split up into two groups: serious opera seria, and what was later known as opera buffa, which is now just a gleam in some composers' eye, like Monteverdi, typical Monteverdi to have thought of it so early. But as the century ended, of course, the opera began to take an entirely new course, but one certainly that was even more important for the, let's say, the exploitation of Italian music than it had ever been before. But nobody was producing an art form that so captivated the entire Western civilized world.
Tastes changed and new ideas caught on very rapidly in the next 150 years. It's most unlikely that Mozart ever heard a note of Monteverdi's music. Hardly anyone did until the 1920s. Monteverdi was an innovator of genius, but any innovation is soon overtaken by another newer still. And his music had no place in the mad pursuit of pleasure, which was to be the ruling passion of 18th century Venice.
espectáculo de la imaginación en contacto en España. Al finalizar, dirigida por Tarkovsky, título de la película del cineasta Michal Lesilovsky.
XEIMP